Erev Tov, everyone. The topic that we are discussing tonight is one which should be handled with a great deal of sensitivity because it deals with issues of marriage, relationships, and the ability for not just couples, but even individuals to be able to conceive and have children, which is a great responsibility, can be a great joy, but when a person or a family is having challenges with it, it can be a source of deep frustration, disappointment, and a lot of emotional and spiritual pain as well. So what I'm going to do tonight is explore some of the halachic issues that come around it. And again, I mentioned this when I proposed it, when I brought it up in Shabbat, but I'll kind of talk about what is the scientific medical, like what are we actually talking about here? And the psychological component, which is very important to this conversation, while it is not the main point tonight, we'll actually see in one of the last sources why the psychological component of the relationship between a mother and a child that she bears, whether she's the mother or a surrogate, and again, we'll define that in a moment, might have an impact on the conversation. So let's start with the definition of what we're talking about tonight. There is more than one variation about of this surrogacy, but the simplest one, certainly that a lot of these halachic positions are thinking about, is typically a married couple, usually a man and woman, and they wish to have children, and for whatever reason, they are not able to. Now, there's all kinds of different procedures and medical interventions that can help them do it, but the one that we're exploring tonight is whereby the woman in the relationship, she has viable eggs, and the man has viable sperm. So they could, they have the makings, the ingredients for a child to bring a life in the world, but the woman is not able to carry a child to term. So they have all the genetic components and building blocks of a child, but the woman cannot grow a child in her womb. So what do? They turn to another woman who is able to do so, and they combine the man's sperm and the woman's egg outside of the womb. And then once it gets to, and this is where my medical knowledge is a bit lacking, I learned the general of it, but basically they start the process, fertilize the egg of the woman, and then they put it into, through a medical procedure, put it into this other woman who may have no relationship to the couple whatsoever. Maybe they'll meet her, maybe not. There's lots of variations. And the child grows inside of the womb of this surrogate mother, who again, genetically, it's coming from these other parents, but they are using her womb, and the child comes to full term. She gives birth to the child, and then that child is returned to the parents. And again, being a surrogate mother, there's actually two important things. One is for any woman to bring a child to term, whether she gave the actual eggs for it or not, there's a lot of emotions there. And there's lots of stories about surrogate mothers who don't want to give up the child, and that's important, but not our point for tonight. But the question that we're going to explore tonight is this. So the building blocks of life come from a Jewish mother and a Jewish father, but let's say that that child, the surrogate mother, is not Jewish. So the child comes out, is born from a non-Jewish mother, but the fertilized egg and the sperm come from Jewish parents. So the question is, what is the identity of that child? And the reality is the flip side of it would also be a valid question. What if there is a Jewish woman who wishes to give birth to a child, and she does not have viable eggs? But if she can get viable eggs from a donor, she can bring a child to term. But the only eggs she can get are from a non-Jewish mother. Again, obviously you would say, well, find a Jewish mother or donate, but let's say that a Jewish woman gets an egg donation or a sperm donation from two non-Jews, and they're fertilized and placed in her. So she is a Jewish mother, but the genetic building blocks of that child come from a non-Jewish person. So the question in both of these cases, what is the child? Is the child Jewish or non-Jewish? What defines the Jewishness at birth of a person? Is it the mother that they are born from, or is it the building blocks, the egg and the sperm that come from the parents? And there's different arguments for both sides of this, and we'll explore some of those different cases. And the reason I said this is the classical thing, man and woman, is certainly today there are other variations. There could be two women who are married, but they wish to have a child. So that might be a case where they, get a donation from a man who's not Jewish. Or you might have two men who also want to donate their sperm so that they have some genetic connection to the child. But the only woman they can find who's a surrogate is a non-Jew. And there's a whole other conversation about whether it's appropriate or permitted for a Jewish woman to even be a surrogate. And one of the reasons is that a Jewish surrogate, if that child is indeed Jewish, but she is a Jewish surrogate for non-Jews, is she then giving over a Jewish child to a non-Jewish family? So most rabbis generally discourage Jewish women from becoming surrogates, but there's certainly cases where it's appropriate, and it's certainly better if it's a Jewish surrogate woman, a Jewish surrogate mother for a Jewish couple. But obviously there's so many variations. So before we even get into the halachic conversation, which does not have a clear answer, but is fairly straightforward, actually I want to pause here. If I said anything that was unclear, if anyone has something to add, or if I missaid anything, I invite any questions or thoughts before we get into the halachic thing. And again, I'm pausing because this isn't just something that, oh, surrogacy, let's jump into it. There's a very significant human component here, which will come up again in one of the last halachic conversations. So any questions up until now? Excellent. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And as I said, there's no one answer to this. So rather than look at all these different opinions from different rabbis, we're actually going to look at the sources these rabbis used. Because whenever you're looking for any new halachic reality, and the reality is you didn't have this idea of surrogacy. They didn't have this kind of technology in the times of the Talmud. They were aware of different kinds of parental relationships. In fact, the most common one, which actually I was talking about someone today, someone in my family, where someone had an Orthodox conversion, but I was talking to my mom about, did they convert before or after they gave birth to the child? Because if the woman was non-Jewish when she conceived, that means the genetic material came from a non-Jew. But if she converts before the child is born, then when she gives birth to the child, she's fully Jewish. So the question is, does the child take the status of the mother at birth or the material which was offered over? So these are real questions. So again, in the Talmud, usually they're talking about often conversion or conception and things like that, about the identity of a child. But these are the sources that all of the rabbis look at to decide what defines a child, where it comes from, i.e. the moment of conception, or where and who the child is born from. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the main sources from the Talmud and even from the Torah that are used for both sides of the argument. So Gloria, if you'll take this first source, a lot of these are from the Talmud, because again, the Talmud is the one that explores all these different conversations, and the Talmud is where all of the details of conversion and different familial relationships are really unpacked. So Gloria, please, source number one, and after each source, I'll explain how it's being used, please.
The rabbis taught in a Baraita, there are three partners in the creation of a person: the Holy One, blessed be He, the Father, and the Mother. The Father seeds the white substance, semen, from which the bones, sinews, nails, brain, and white of the eye are formed. The Mother seeds the red substance, from which the skin, flesh, hair, and black and white of the eye are formed. And the Holy One, blessed be He, places in him the spirit of life, the soul, the facial countenance, eyesight, hearing, the power of speech and walking, and insight and understanding.
Excellent, thank you. So there are a few components to this. First, there's this beautiful idea that there are three partners in creation of a human being. Obviously, the mother and father give the physical components to a life, but the spiritual component comes from God. So when a couple comes together, then God is a part of that relationship, that conception of life. The second thing here, which we won't go into too much, is the medical understanding here is not quite, it's not completely off. The idea that there are different genetic components that come from both the mother and the father mixed together, but some of the understanding of the science here and the idea of homunculus, fully formed person coming from the fathers, from the semen, all of these things are explored in the Talmud. They're not 100% correct, but the importance of the source of this, everything that makes a person who they are comes at the moment of conception, i.e. what comes from the parents. So the moment that a person is conceived, what the mother offers, the egg, and the father, the semen, the sperm, that is what, and God giving the spirit, that is what makes a person who they are. The focus of what makes a person who they are in the end is the moment of conception and the genetic material that makes them. It has nothing to do with the birth. Now, This source here is more midrashic. This is not a halachic legal conversation. It's a beautiful idea about how life is formed. However, because there's no clear legal ruling anywhere in the Talmud or Torah regarding our conversation, you have to turn to midrashic material. And I just want to pause there again for a moment. When you have a legal conversation and there's no legal, if you're talking about someone broke into someone's house, there's dozens of conversations in the Talmud, in the Torah, that you could base off of, infer off of legal precedents. There's not really a legal precedent for much of our conversation. There is when it comes to that, some of the things about conversion, but oftentimes when the rabbis are at a loss for a legal basis, then they often turn to midrashic, this beautiful Dvar Torah type material, and it becomes, one of their main sources. So the next source here, again, these next sources are all just going to kind of confirm the idea. So Leonard, if you'll take source number 2, please.
Rava challenged from a Braita which states, because of this decree, a male convert and a female convert who are married prior to their conversion must wait 3 months after the conversion before resuming relations, so that we will know whether she was pregnant prior to the conversion. Now, if the purpose of the decree is to distinguish between the offspring of the first husband and that of the second, it should not apply in this case, for here, what is there to distinguish between? She was married to the same man both before and after the conversion. The Gemara answers, here too, in the case of converts, it is necessary to distinguish between offspring that was conceived in sanctity and offspring that were now conceived in sanctity.
Was not conceived. Excellent, thank you. So this is actually a conversation that I was mentioning about, is somebody who they get pregnant, but when they're not Jewish, and then they convert to Judaism. The question is, what is the identity of that child? Because that child was conceived from an egg of a non-Jewish woman, but now that woman is Jewish. So what defines the identity of that child? So that question is right there in the Talmud. So the rabbi's suggestion is, if the couple wants to conceive, wait until they're Jewish before they conceive, so that there's no question about it. And as the Talmud will explore, there's not necessarily a clear answer here. In fact, one of the things that we'll get to in the end is, because there's a lack of a clear question, there's kind of, this is the best policy to make sure we don't get into these kinds of we don't get into these questions, so there's no question about the identity of the child. But these are real questions that are relevant here about the identity. What makes a person Jewish at birth? Again, is it the mother they are born from, her identity at the time, or her identity when she conceives, or again, the donator, whoever the genetic material comes from? And the last source in this section, Tamar, going to go ahead and unmute you. And again, we're still in the Talmud here. And one of the interesting things here is, we're not talking about, what we're talking about here is really a metaphysical, spiritual thing. Because to be Jewish, even though, yes, we talk about there being a genetic, physical component, really to be Jewish is a matter of soul. So the question is, what is the moment a soul enters a body? Is it the moment they're born, or is it the moment that they are conceived? The moment that their genetic material, i.e. the egg and the sperm, come into existence in the world. So that's relevant for this conversation. Tamar, bavakasha.
And Antoninus said to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, from when is the soul placed in a person? Is it from the moment of conception, or from the moment of formation of the embryo, 40 days after conception? Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said to him, it is from the moment of the formation of the embryo. Antoninus said to him, what that is inconceivable. It is possible that a piece of meat could stand for even 3 days without salt as a preservative and would not rot. The embryo could not exist for 40 days without a soul. Rather, the soul is placed in man from the moment of conception. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said, Antoninos taught me this matter, and there is a verse that supports him, as it is stated, and your providence has preserved my spirit, from Job 10:12, indicating that it is from the moment of conception, that the soul is preserved within a person.
Thank you, Tamar. And this is so interesting because Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi having this conversation with this, I believe, Roman official, and these conversations may or may not have ever happened, but there's certainly a teaching tool that the Talmud uses, and maybe they happen or some variation of them. But the point of the conversation is Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was implying that a person becomes a person, whether Jewish, not Jewish, later. Now, he doesn't say at the moment of birth, but still well on into the development of the child, which would be relevant for surrogacy, because typically you don't have the Jewish mother, have the child grow in her belly for multiple months and then transfer it to the surrogate mother. It usually starts pretty early on. And he has this interest, they use a lot of imagery of meat in the Talmud, and often very horrible ways. But he says here, look, a physical body cannot be sustained without a soul. So for a child to be growing inside of a mother for 40 days and up to 9 months, it could not exist without a soul sustaining it. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says, you know what, you're right. God, from this verse on Eov and from this non-Jewish man Antoninos, that's a good point. The soul sustains physical life, and I learned something from this non-Jewish. So there's actually a lot of beautiful things from this story. But he says that life begins the moment a child is conceived, from the earliest points of creation, which again would have doesn't matter who the surrogate mother is. If the parents are Jewish, and today, because I didn't mention this earlier, because we have matrilineal descent, meaning at least in the Orthodox world, most of conservative world as well, a person's Jewish identity is defined by the mother. If the egg donor is Jewish, then no matter who the mother or who the birth mother is, that child comes out as Jewish. And again, many rabbis take these sources and others, and they're all basically the same variation about when does a child become that person, when do they take on their identity, and they all basically argue conception. Now, some of these sources, particularly the middle one, really does kind of give legal implication for it, or makes it a legal conversation about conversion and when to conceive, et cetera, like that. But ultimately, all of these sources, none of them are quite knockout sources. And the second one, which is sort of a legal conversation, sort of dabbles in the ambiguity and the unclear, because you want to be clear. We're not sure exactly the identity of the child. So just to make sure, have them separate and not conceive a child until they're both Jewish. But all of these sources are used for the side that say a child's identity, human's identity is a conception. So whoever, particularly the mother, whoever the egg comes from, that mother would make the child Jewish. So if it's a non-Jewish, and based on that, if the egg is donated, let's say a Jewish woman cannot produce her own eggs, but a non-Jewish woman donates an egg that grows inside of the womb of a Jewish woman, that child would still need to convert. And at the end of the day, that's the practical question we're asking here. Do these children need to convert? Which is not always so simple as, oh, it's much easier than converting an adult. But to know that a child's converted, first of all, they can't marry, issues with Kohanim and priests and stuff like that, and or question their identity. Like if you're born of a Jewish mother, you want to know that you're just Jewish in your kishkas. So it's very relevant. So before we go on to the next sources for the other opinion, any questions up until now? And for all those who are not on video and just listening in, it is wonderful to have you here. And you're free when we take breaks to unmute and ask your questions, and we'll have time at the end. So Lynn, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And the second set of sources, which you see starts with a Torah source, implies or argues, or they're used to say that the identity of the child is based on the mother who actually gives birth to the child. It doesn't matter if the egg is from a Jewish mother, a non-Jewish mother, a dragon, it doesn't matter. Whoever I know you're joking about the dragon, but there is a conversation in the Talmud about a woman giving birth to non-human creatures and what their identity is. But these are sources that are used to argue that what really matters is the mother who gives birth to the child. So Lynn, the first source, please, and there's a lot going on in this source, but it's in the book of Shemot, and it talks about a legal case in which two men are fighting in a bar and they hit a pregnant woman and injure her and cause her to have a miscarriage, which again, that's really traumatic, but they're here more on the legally, what are they liable for injuring a woman, injuring a child, etc. So go ahead, Lynn, please.
If men strive and hurt a woman with child so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no further harm ensue, he shall be surely punished according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine.
Thank you. As a side point, this is one of the main sources in the conversation on abortion and whether it's permitted, because the outcome of this is that they caused a miscarriage, but the case is not dealt with as manslaughter. It's a civil case because it's not that they killed a child, it's that they damaged the woman and they have to pay civil damages there. So we're not going to go more into it than that, but it's a very important source in that conversation, how it's used. But the relevance here is something very, very simple. Let me see if I can find it in the Hebrew. Yeah, they just say the Hebrew, when it says, they say in the English, her fruit depart from her, but the Hebrew is more straightforward. It say, veyatzu, and goes out from her, yeladeha, her child. And the significance there is that it says her child. So the identity of the child is not, not that you would expect the Torah to say the child that is connected to the genetic material of the donor of it, but the important thing is they point to the source and say that the child is connected to the mother. Simple as that. Again, that was not the intention of this verse. This is about damages when a pregnant woman is injured and what is the status of that injury, and does it matter whether a child is inside, the fact that she's pregnant. That's the conversation at hand. But the way that this is used and the fact that it's a Torah verse gives it a lot more weight, is the fact that the language that it chooses to use is that that child is of the mother. So for some people, that is a knockout punch. The counter to it, of course, is that's not at all what the verse is talking about. Regardless, it is used as one of the sources, arguing that the child is defined by the mother in which that child grows. Now, these next three sources are all directly connected. And again, there's some other Talmudic sources, but I brought these because we just had Purim, and it's interesting to look inside and see how a verse from the book of Esther becomes so relevant to this conversation. So what it is the verse in Esther talks about Esther and her parentage or lack thereof. Then it brings a Talmudic source that sort of explores the question about the language used in the book of Esther, and then Rashi explains what it's talking about and brings it relevantly back to us. And there are other sources that do argue for it being the birth mother, but these are the ones that kind of stood out to me, and I think were clearer. So Jane, I'll just let you boom, 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 take all three of these. So first, the verse from Esther about her parentage or kind of lack thereof, as you'll see.
And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maiden was of beautiful form and fair to look on. And when her father and mother were dead, Mordecai took her for his own daughter. Excellent.
So it talks about how Mordecai raised her and became her daughter, even though they had a different familial relationship. But the key here is this. It says right on, let me see if I could, en la avaem. It says, in the first sentence, she did not have a mother and father. She's an orphan. But then later on, it repeats again, avia ve'ima, mot avia ve'ima, that her father and mother were dead. And the Talmud we already know that she's an orphan. So why did you need to say it twice? Why are you going so hard on the fact that her mother and father are dead? So the Talmud is going to start the conversation, and then Rashi will bring it home. So please, Jane, source number 3.
For she had neither father nor mother. And when her father and mother died, Esther
that's it. These are the 2 times that it says it.
Right.
Yeah.
Why did it need to say this again? Achaz said, when her mother became pregnant with her, her father died. When she was born, her mother died. So it was 2 separate events. It's not like they died in an accident together.
Correct.
And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her for his own daughter.
Excellent. So the fact that her father died early, that's actually not the focus here, but it's the moment at which her mother died. Her mother died in childbirth when she was giving birth to her. And now Rashi's going to say why that's so important. And now I'll tie it back to our conversation. So Jane, Rashi, who comments directly there in the Talmud.
And when she was born, her mother died, and it was not seen to call her mother.
So what this Talmud is arguing, or at least Rashi's explanation, again, how people understand it, is because the mother died, not like the child, this is the key thing, it's not the child was born, Esther was born, and then the mother died. The mother died before the act of birthing was done. In other words, there was no mother that gave birth to her, because the person that was her mother was died before the birth was complete. The reason that's relevant here is because what we care about in identifying who the parents are, i.e. her identity, a Jewish mother, is who gave birth to her. And even though this is obviously getting a little like, this is not really how we define it medically or scientifically, the understanding of the Talmud, or Rashi's understanding, is that no mother actually gave birth to her, because her mother died before the birth was finished. And if you don't have a mother give birth to you, then it's as if you don't have a mother, you don't have an identity. So her identity became that of Mordechai. He became, in some ways, and this is explored further in other sources, became quite almost literally, we wouldn't just say spiritually, but almost physically and literally became her parent. And she would take on his identity because she was born in this world without any identity whatsoever. Now, yes, that is a bit of a stretch, but that's not the point. The point here is that these sources are used to argue that Esther's identity would have been by her birth mother, but because her mother died before she gave birth to her, she had no identity. She had no mother, as it were. But if she did have a mother who gave birth to her, that would be her mother. That would define who she is. So again, there are other sources that explore this in slightly different, very confusing variations, but ultimately, you see both sides have sources. And again, a lot of those sources are a bit of a stretch. But the reason that's important for us in this conversation is neither side has a knockout punch. And that's the problem here. That's a problem with a lot of things, about abortion, about brain death, about these really controversial topics, or these difficult topics, is if there was a clear ruling from the Talmud or the Torah, this wouldn't be a big conversation. But we don't have strong legal precedents for it, because a lot of these medical things are new, and the writers, the authors of the Talmud, were not aware of this. So today we have to go back and we have to unpack and stretch and finagle and rework things to apply them to today. But what we end up with today is you have sources and rabbis. Yes, Gloria, I see you. I'll go ahead and mute you, but we have rabbis on both sides that have evidence for their opinions, but nobody can say, obviously, I'm right and you're wrong. Yeah, go ahead, Gloria, please.
Does the Hebrew make clear that the mother died first before she was born? Because to me, it sounds like it's somewhat ambiguous. When she was born, her mother died. It could mean first she was born and then the mother died.
The language in the order of the Hebrew in the book of Esther, uvemot, and in the death aviha, of her father, ve'ima, and her mother. Now again, the text may just do that order for whatever, because men were given more respect, so the father, is always placed first, or maybe it was, the author Esther herself who simply just put it that. There's a million other reasons for it. To imply that the word father is put before mother simply because he died first, that's not a huge stretch. Like, that's not wild. Obviously, one of them, would have probably died before the other, but it's not really so much the point of and this is actually important. It's not really the point of what the Talmud about the order of them dying. The point is that the mother died in childbirth. Now, the book of Esther doesn't actually say that. And that's my point here. You could go and say, the book of Esther doesn't say any of this. This is all midrashic material. The Talmud picks up on the fact that something is a little weird about the verse. Why is it repeating it? That's a great question. That is a literary question that should be explored. And the answer here is a possible answer, but it's still midrashic. It is not a legal ruling. It's the rabbis coming up with a clever possible answer to it. And then today, because we don't have anything super concrete to go off of, this is what we're doing. It's essentially grasping at straws, but these straws are part of our tradition. They are holy, they are sacred, they're part of our Talmud, part of our early rabbis. And based on the conclusions that they make, that's kind of the best we can do. And I don't want to diminish the opinions of Rashi and the rabbis who base their opinions on it. But the point is, nobody has a source that is a clear black and white source that would imply either way about what actually makes a child Jewish, whether it's conception, i.e. the genetic material, which again, that's not the language of the Talmud anyways, or the mother who gives birth to it. And there's nothing that, again, because you have sources on both sides, you can't even say common sense. But does that kind of respond to what you were saying, Gloria? The reason they say father first is literally the word father comes before mother, but it's not necessarily the main thrust here of the argument. And in fact, the Talmudic source, the first 2 and 3 don't even really matter. All it really matters is what Rashi says and how it's used. Excellent.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So these last 2 sources here are very interesting. So the first one here is from an incredible website. It's called Nishmat or Yoatzot. And these are women, these Yoatzot, those who give advice. These are women who are trained. Their main training is in areas of women's weekly, God forbid weekly, monthly menstrual cycle, known as Nida in the Torah, laws around that, but other laws regarding women about pregnancy, marriage, things that are specifically in the realm of women. Now, these Yoatzot know quite a bit more than just laws regarding to a woman's health and areas of sexuality. They are essentially rabbis, and in fact, particularly in the areas in which their expertise, they often know more than rabbis, to the point where even though I am trained in this and I've seen the same sources that they do and I am qualified to rule, if a woman comes to me with a personal question, I might send her to one of these yoetzet halacha, not because I'm incapable of it, but because it's more powerful and more comfortable often for a woman to speak to another woman about what's going on in their body. And there are times that I've dealt with women directly, but these yoetzot halacha are some of the most brilliant, well-trained, and just incredible, sensitive women. And any city that has one is lucky. I think New York has like 5, and I think the Midwest has like 1. So it's, not so even. But there's a website in which they post their opinions, and their halachic decisor, meaning they still turn to a rabbi, was Rabbi Yehuda Henkin. He passed away, I think it was just last year. He was one of the greatest rabbis in history. And I think we would define him as one of the few true halachic decisors, post-scheme, of the modern Orthodox world, whether or not he would call himself modern Orthodox. And his students have actually published a book that's in Hebrew and English based on his opinions. But this website, Nishpat or Yoatzot, is one of the best resources, including for a rabbi, to get different opinions, different answers, and to send men and women to learn about different issues. And there's an article that deals with egg donation and surrogacy. And it's going to review a little bit of the conversation we've had, and also the question of, so a woman uses a surrogate, what is that child? Is that child Jewish or not? So let's see. Here, I'll take this one. There is no clear halachic consensus as to whether the status of the child as a Jew is based on the genetic mother, the birth mother, or both. We'll come back to that both thing in the last source. Using a Jewish surrogate and or a known Jewish egg donor is preferred when possible, so that there's no doubt about the baby's religious status. So if it's a Jewish mother and she's giving the egg, they should use a surrogate who's Jewish. And I said not everybody agrees that's appropriate, but maybe that's ideal, and vice versa. In practice, babies born from procedures involving non-Jewish surrogates or egg donors, either the parties are non-Jewish, often undergo conversion in early infancy to ensure that they are considered Jewish according to all opinions. Now, practically, it's not so difficult practically, but again, it's not so simple, and it does affect the status of the child, because to many, that child will always be seen as a convert. Now, a convert can still marry Jewish, live a Jewish life, their children are Jewish, etc., but it's still a pretty big statement about their identity when they might be fully Jewish. Since they are contractually obligated to carry the baby, surrogates cannot be anonymous. In order to rule out an unwitting future marriage between halachic siblings, Jewish egg donors should be known or listed in a registry. That, by the way, is one of the reasons that a lot of rabbis frown on surrogacy, because they might say, well, you're the surrogate mother, so you don't really have a relationship to our child. And the surrogate mother then does surrogacy for 50 children that may or may not be siblings. We did not even get into that. If a surrogate mother has multiple children from different donors, do those children have any relationship? So to make sure that none of those children get married, it gets really sticky. And a note, they say, at this point in time, the medical establishment is less concerned than the halachic establishment about the chances of sibling marriage, because the statistical odds are very low. So yes, it's unlikely to happen, but for Jews, we don't want brothers and sisters to marry, because then that child will be a halachic mamzer. It'll be very, very bad, because it's a forbidden relationship. Marital relations are not involved in vitro fertilization, meaning taking the egg and sperm from a donor and then placing it in another party, another woman. Nevertheless, the surrogate or donor should ideally be a woman for whom relations with the genetic father would not violate a serious sexual prohibition, Guli Ariot, since some halachic authorities argue that that would have negative halachic implications for the child. So, for example, if the surrogate mother is married, and then the man who's donating the sperm is also married, some might say, even though they're not actually sleeping with each other, the fact that the things that come from them are creating a new child, it's as if they've committed adultery. So again, there's a lot of reasons that a lot of people say Jews shouldn't be surrogates. It's better to have a non-Jewish surrogate, ideally who's single, and then convert the child. And all of this is very sticky. And this isn't just the halachic thing, the psychological components are significant. Therefore, a Jewish surrogate or donor should not be closely related to either parent, ergo not a first-degree relative, and should ideally be unmarried. So there's no question of abstract adultery. Some authorities may permit using a married surrogate on a case-by-case basis, following individual consultation, because no act of prohibited relations is involved in these procedures. Yes, a married man is giving over his seed to a technically married woman, but they're not actually doing anything. So this is not a closed case. There are rabbis who will say to a couple that's been struggling and suffering for a decade to have a child, and the only way they can do it is with a married Jewish surrogate who they trust, and that child will be Jewish. The rabbi might permit it in that one case, but there has not been blanket rulings that would cover all these different variations. At this stage, Nishmat's rabbis, and this is currently on the website, so this is their current official advice. Rabbis do not make rulings on the question of whether it is permissible for a married woman to be a surrogate, though they recognize rulings from other halachic authorities. So they're saying this is a sticky issue. Good luck. We support what you do. We're not getting into it. And Rav Yehuda Henkin, Zichron Livracha, were he alive, it'd be curious what he would rule on it today and whether it would have changed. So we basically saw that there's no consensus, and the general practice is if either of the parties are non-Jewish, to convert, and ideally both parties, i.e. the egg donor and the surrogate mother, should be Jewish, so there's no questions. But using a Jewish surrogate raises some other issues, which, oy vavoy, we're not getting into that. So any questions up until now? Yeah, Jane, please.
Yeah, I mean, there are a ton of questions, but am I unmuted?
You are unmuted. So maybe
Yeah,
focus on the ones that will
there are a ton
clarify
of
what we have
questions
now.
that come up, and I'm sure you can't answer all of them. One is
we'll have time at the end. We can ask more about them, but focus more on the immediacy of.
Just the immediate question that came to mind is you said that the baby can be converted.
Yes.
So a baby, that I didn't know that a baby doesn't have to go through any of the teaching, learning motions.
Yes. So there's, without going into all the details, there's a phrase in Hebrew called a ger katan, ger being convert and katan meaning a minor. And this is in it's kind of a little bit of a case-by-case basis, but the ideal situation are two Jewish parents, typically who would adopt a non-Jewish child when they're a baby or under the age of 13. And if the Beit Din is convinced that the child will be raised in an observant home, because that child as a baby is certainly too young to learn Torah, they'll convert the child. However, someone will say, wait, but that child is a free will human being. What if they don't want to be Jewish? And the rabbinic system has a response to that, which is when the child becomes a legal adult, 12 or 13 for a boy or girl, they are asked, do you wish to continue being Jewish? And if the answer is yes, then the conversion holds. So they do not need to go through a formal conversion study process. It just needs to be clear that they'll be raised in a Jewish household. And in fact, I was asked to sit on a Beit Din for a couple where the father was Jewish and the mother was not Jewish. And they had a child and they wanted to convert their child. And one of the questions was about what kind of household they would be raised in. And the father himself was not very observant. And the mother made it very clear that she was going to continue her Christian identity, which again, I have full respect for that, but she was going to live as a Christian, go to church, celebrate Christmas. And the Beit Din unanimously ruled that they did not feel that child, it would be appropriate to convert them because they wouldn't be raised in a Jewish atmosphere. That was very painful situation to be in, but that's, an example. of where a ger katan, it would not be appropriate to do so. But an Orthodox couple that adopts a 2 or 3-year-old, and everyone knows that 2 or 3-year-old is going to be the frummest kid on the block, no problem there. Also in practice, they usually don't have the little bar mitzvah boy come up there and before he gives his Dvar Torah, do you still want to be Jewish before you give your drash? Sometimes they don't say anything, sometimes it's implicit, implied, etc., like that, but they are given the opportunity, and there are cases where a child will say, I never wanted to be Jewish, and they automatically become non-Jewish. So it is a real thing, a ger katan. So I hope that kind of answers that question for now. Excellent. So we'll go on this last source, then we'll open it up for more questions. So this is from an incredible article from 2 doctors, and I believe one is a Rabbi Moshe Tendler at Yeshiva University, and Dr. Loiki, and they have this amazing article online. It's not terribly long, it's 20-30 pages, and it brings in more of these sources, explores it deeply. But one of the things that they add to the conversation, which actually a little bit more in the side of the birth mother, is that oftentimes we think about the birth mother, the surrogate mother, and the genetic material are 2 separate entities. The genetic material is always going to be, whether that the egg and the sperm from the father, whether they're in woman A, the birth mother, it doesn't matter who, they'll come out the exact same. But new scientific advances have shown that that's not quite true. If a surrogate mother is given a fertilized egg from another woman, her body will have genetic and psychological and all of these effects on the child. So something very much of her in a very real physical way will affect that child. So it's not easy to just say, all we care about is what the child, the mother that he comes out of. There's more to it than that. A surrogate mother actually becomes kind of a third parent in a very real way. So here's their conversation. Who is the halachic mother of the child? From a halachic perspective, the fact that the surrogate is not merely an incubator for fetal development, but significantly contributes cellular and epigenetic instructions. And again, this article brings in the first 10 pages are all the scientific realities of it. Instructions to the fetus she is gestating must be considered in the deliberations of identifying the halachic mother of the child. At first glance, one might use this scientific information to support the view that the surrogate mother should be viewed as the halachic mother child. In this sense, the gestational surrogate, gestational meaning where the baby actually grows and develops in, is not merely following the DNA instructions of the gamete donor, i.e. the original parents. Both the surrogate and the egg donor significantly contribute biologically and genetically to fetal development. Again, in a real way, this is a child of 3 parents. Since there is no universally agreed halachic precedent to this issue of halachic motherhood in the surrogate, as we've seen before, the Teshuvah of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who passed away just a few years ago, I think maybe 2015, one of the greatest rabbis, and it was in Israel, remains most compelling. And this is what he argued in his Teshuvah, namely that both the genetic and gestational woman should be considered as the halachic mothers of the child. So what does that mean practically? Ultimately, most rabbis would say, since it's defined by both of them, ultimately you can't say they're Jewish and you can't say they're non-Jewish, so it's probably better to convert so there's no questions. But Rabbi Shlomo is saying there is something of both parents, of both mothers in this child. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach supports the view that there are no definitive halachic precedents that would define motherhood in the case of surrogacy. Thus, halacha requires the child born from a non-Jewish surrogate to convert, and that a Kohen should not marry a woman who was born from a non-Jewish surrogate, even though she was conceived using an egg and sperm obtained from a Jewish couple. And I said that is an important thing. Kohanim are not allowed to marry converts. So this conversation has a lot of important implications. Oh, that was the end of it then. Excellent. So this last thing here is pointing out that the idea of surrogacy is much more complex than even the most recent halachic literature explores, and that the conversation is far from over. Although it seems like they're arguing here that really the best case scenario is to convert a child where one of the parties is non-Jewish. The Nishmat website is suggesting that as well, or to have both parties be Jewish, which creates other potential issues. So there is no good answer for this. However, that's not the important takeaway. The important takeaway is that a couple that wishes to conceive and have a child, there's certainly always the option of adoption, but there is something significant about having a child born of them. And if there is a way to do it, Jewish law can make room for that. It might be a little messy and it might create a situation where, fine, maybe they're converts, maybe they're not. It affects who they might be able to marry. But at the end of the day, Jewish law makes room that there are medical ways for a child for a family who is struggling to bring a child of their own into the world. And Jewish law both recognizes that, struggles with it, but also affirms that it is their child. But it also recognizes the feelings and the reality of the surrogate mother as well. So it's an ongoing conversation. There's no one final a resolution to all of it. But again, at the end of the day, the most important thing here is these families that have suffered. In many cases, they need suffer no more. And Judaism recognizes that and will work with them to help make that child part of their family and their community.